In today's video, we're going to take a behind-the-scenes look into the world of Takashi Murakami, and specifically his massive production studio in Japan. If you didn't know, Takashi Murakami is a world-famous Japanese artist, most well known for his large, detailed, precisely produced paintings and sculptures. He's also very well known for his development of the super flat style, a way of composing images that lack any distinction between the foreground and background. But similarly to my previous videos, I could spend hours and multiple videos talking about Takashi's endless portfolio of amazing work, but in this video I want to take a more detailed look into his process, his equipment, and the somewhat unique role that his assistants play in creating the artwork, and then just a deeper look at his large warehouse production studio in general. As I've mentioned before, I've had a long-standing interest and enthusiasm for creative spaces and looking behind the scenes into creative work, into the processes, the studios, the setups of artists, designers, creators of all kinds. So if you're interested in seeing more of these kinds of videos, definitely consider hitting the like button and subscribe. Takashi Murakami has two main studios where his art is produced, one in New York and the other in Saitama, north of Tokyo. In this video, we're going to take a deeper look at Murakami's studio in Japan, just because, as far as I understand, it is certainly the larger of the two, but more so the primary production studio for most of his work. It's not too important to distinguish the two because they are both set up in very similar ways, so I'll be including photos from both of the studios, but I am going to primarily focus on his studio in Japan. So when looking at the Japan studio, I think the first thing to mention here is the size of the space. And of course, this is partly to accommodate the extremely large size of the artwork, often spanning multiple canvases in width. And hopefully some of these photos demonstrate just how big these canvases actually are, as well as how much detail there is. The other reason, of course, is that every stage of the artwork's production happens within the studio. So there's just a base level of space required in order to house all of the computers, the offices, printing rooms, storage, all of the paints and materials, which we'll look at in a minute. The other very noticeable thing about Murakami's studio, which I want to focus on for a few minutes, is the level of organization, right? Which just on a personal level is something that I always really love seeing, particularly in creative spaces. I've had a tendency to organize my stuff in quite specific and careful and organized ways, so I love seeing other people do the same thing. One of the first things that I noticed in many of these photos are the massive amounts of screen prints. I'd definitely be interested to know what kind of systems they actually have in place to manage and produce all of the screen prints. My guess is that the screen prints we see in these photos have been made well in advance of the artwork's actual scheduled production. And so when it comes time to make the actual artwork, to do the screen printing, all of the necessary pieces of the artwork, all of the materials and the tools are ready to use within the main production hall that you can see here. And as we move forward, you'll see that this level of meticulous planning and organization is quite a recurring feature in Murakami's studio. Another common form of organization in the studio are these yellow boxes, which seem to mostly be for the management and storage of paints, which of course is probably one of the most important aspects of the studio, as well as the screen prints that we just talked about. So we can see that there is quite a lot of careful thought and intentional effort in the organization of these materials. And this is very important, particularly in the context of Murakami's production line of artwork. And I think the reason I'm so interested in looking at this kind of stuff is because there's just this appreciation for efficiency and effectiveness. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, having equipment organized and easily accessible reduces a significant amount of friction between you and your art being made. And of course, it makes the production of the artwork a lot quicker and arguably a lot more fun for those people involved. Now, just to clarify, the reason that they have all of the paints in small pots like this is because when the digital version is printed out, which I'll talk about later in the video, they have to mix the paint to match the printed version. So by mixing a custom pot of that color, they then don't have to constantly remix it every time they want to use it on the canvas. Just before we continue, if you want to go and check out my own artwork and support me on Instagram, I'm trying to hit 1,000 followers on Instagram before the end of the year, and I'm currently at 300. If you want to go and help me out, I'd greatly appreciate it, but if you don't, no worries. So another very important and very organized component within Murakami's studio are his assistants. And I'll talk more about their role in the production process in a minute, but it's quite clear that his assistants are also very structured and carefully delegated certain tasks within the studio. Here we can see that at 8:50 every weekday morning, unless he's not in Tokyo, Murakami leads the staff of his art studio, Kaikai Kiki Company, in a round of calisthenics. Then the employees go off to their various jobs, refining sketches on the computer, daubing paint meticulously onto paintings and sculptures, fielding requests for commercial tie-ins or press interviews with their boss, negotiating licenses and other business contracts, or coordinating with the branch office in Brooklyn. And here we have some interesting photos of the work shift breakdown, which carefully details how many people are working on what project and the projects that are in progress and which have been paused. Now, obviously this kind of employee scheduling is quite standard in most businesses, right? But seeing this alone, you probably wouldn't think it was for a painting studio. Partly because of the amount of people involved, but also because of the meticulous nature of the schedule, as you can see. We tend to think of art being made in a much more fluid and free-flowing, spontaneous manner. So I definitely think it's quite unusual and certainly fascinating, at least from my perspective, to see this level of organisation behind the production of art. Murakami's 60 employees punch in with computerised time cards, and the company has training manuals for new hires. The hours are regular and long. One daily ritual is the question and answer period, in which staff members book a slot of specified duration to ask the chief a question. When I attended, 14 had requested interviews, typically of 2 minutes each. So again, super interesting to get an insight into this and see what's actually required to manage such a large operation. Whilst I didn't want to comment too much on Murakami's actual work, of course the size and the detailed nature of the work is very important to recognise and point out, because this kind of work not only takes an enormous amount of time to produce, but simply wouldn't be possible without the production line that we see in this studio, and of course without all of Murakami's assistants. So yes, one person could feasibly create these pieces of work alone, but it would take such a long time that it's just not really feasible. And particularly as Murakami faces a lot of increasing demand for his work in recent years. So the work is ultimately a product of the studio and the team, rather than Murakami alone. And I personally like to think of Takashi Murakami as the entire production, with Takashi himself just being one component within that. It's very clear that his assistants are an integral part of the artwork, and I suspect are certainly very happy to be a part of it, right? They're definitely not just mindless workers desperate to clock out at 5 p.m. From assembling silk screens to applying gold leaf, a majority of assistants take on a single task and master it with the utmost care and precision. They are loyal to the duties mandated on a dry erase board that sits next to the entrance of the studio, where each of their names is paired with a cutout portrait. What's interesting is that all of the departments work under one roof, or at least in one location. The studio does send some of the digital work from the Japan studio to the New York studio for painting, but generally it seems that at least the majority of the production process actually happens just in one location. I think even Murakami's own home is located right next to the studio, if he isn't famously literally living and sleeping in the studio himself, which apparently is a fairly frequent thing. You can see him sleeping on the floor here, and even a photo of a makeshift bed cubicle made out of wood and cardboard, which actually does look quite cozy to me. I wouldn't mind sleeping in there myself. He literally camps down in his factory-sized studio in Miyoshi, a rather bleak, predominantly industrial area about an hour outside of Tokyo. He sleeps there in a large cardboard box in a corner of one of the rooms. He eats there, often preparing his own simple meals. And of course, he works there. The studio is in operation 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In the early evening, the night shift takes over from the day shift, and the hectic working schedule runs on. Despite the finished product of Murakami's warehouse production often being these extremely detailed, sometimes very complex compositions, the first stage, as with most artists, is usually a very rough sketch or idea. Murakami explains that when I'm inspired to create, it's not any profound process. It's more like I have an antenna and pick up something, a word or an image, and do a little memo, scribble, or sketch. I'll give maybe 15 or 20% of these ideas to my assistants to create digitally so that they are more concrete and we can look at them. So it does seem like there is this constant back and forth between Murakami and his assistants, as following this, Murakami paints his work in Adobe Illustrator, tweaking the composition and cycling through thousands of colours until at last he hands the finished versions off to his assistants. So it does look like, at least in some cases, that Murakami is heavily involved in the digital colouring stage. The article goes on to say, without the embrace of technology, Murakami says, I could have never produced this many works this efficiently, and the work wouldn't be as intense. And then of course one major component of Murakami's studio, which you can see in the photos, is these long rows of computers, which are mostly composed of what look like Wacom drawing tablets that double as computer monitors. So if you didn't know, the artists can actually physically draw onto their screens, and then connected up to those are 2013 Mac Pros, if you were curious about what kind of equipment the artists were using. It may seem like Murakami's assistants are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, both literally in some cases and certainly creatively speaking, but as I've tried to explain, this is very intentional, and this is the machine that they've built, but of course none of it would be in motion without the first cog of Murakami generating the ideas, and then of course going back and forth forth with his assistants, fine-tuning the ideas over a lot of iterations. So they are a team after all, and there are a number of interviews and videos of Murakami discrediting himself and really emphasizing that the work is a product of a team effort. Murakami says, "I realize that I feel happy not when a work is complete, but when I see everyone who participated in it celebrating. And so maybe my path as an individual artist, painter, was a vocation, not a passion. And what I really enjoyed were group efforts where you create something together." So again, just really interesting and kind of fascinating to get an insight into the relationship between Murakami and his assistants. It's definitely quite unusual. Definitely don't really see this with a lot of other artists, so it's certainly quite a unique thing to observe. Moving on in the process, obviously a big part of the production involves taking Murakami's rough ideas and then turning them into complete digital vector images. Sometimes they'll even take the rough sketch and print it out in full size that you can see here in order to get a really accurate sense of how the artwork is going to look in full scale. Now, just to get a bit technical, the artists use Adobe Illustrator to create the images rather than something like Photoshop. And the reason for this is because it's much easier to create and manipulate vectors in Illustrator versus pretty much any other program. So if you didn't know, a vector is an object or a line that can be scaled infinitely without decreasing or changing in resolution, which of course is very useful in the context of Murakami's workflow. We can see that they regularly print out large versions of the artwork for Murakami to edit and review, and then of course they're transferred onto screen prints for the screen printing stage. So it's very important that the images can be scaled to any size whilst remaining perfectly crisp and high quality. And vector images, vector digital files allow that to be done. One interesting thing about this stage is that it looks like the team will print out the digital artwork every time a major change is made, so that Murakami can review each stage and potentially revert back to previous versions if necessary. And of course, this is definitely a very unique aspect of their production that I've never really seen anywhere else. And as we've seen, there are a lot of stages of iteration, and you can see Murakami here using tracing paper to test changes and suggest edits to his assistants. One final interesting and somewhat unique thing about their digital workflow is that because his work features a number of recurring motifs, eyeballs, mushrooms, flowers, the factory maintains an immense electronic archive of renderings that he can cut and paste into the files he's working on. Murakami may be the first artist to make paintings from his own portfolio of digital clip art. And then of course the final stages of production involve transferring the finalized digital artwork onto a canvas, primarily with the use of screen prints, which we briefly talked about earlier. If you're familiar with all of Murakami's work, you'll know that the team really uses quite a wide range of different painting techniques, from screen printing, of course, both on a large and small scale, to careful, intricate hand painting with small brushes, and then other times with large washes of textural paint, and then other completely different materials like gold leaf, which is quite a common feature of Murakami's work. So there's a lot of different techniques being used within his work, requiring a lot of people and a lot of expertise to produce these kinds of artworks. So that just about ends the video. We've looked at a lot of different aspects of Murakami's studio and process, and hopefully you found something interesting or enjoyable or new that you didn't know before. For me personally, I just find this stuff fascinating, and I love behind the scenes. I just love seeing how things are done, how things are made, the process by which these amazing pieces of artwork are brought into existence. I have such a deep fascination with understanding the inner workings of things, particularly creative work, and so hopefully you guys can resonate with that and are equally interested in it as I am. But that's the end of the video. If you want to see more of these kinds of videos, definitely consider liking and subscribe, because I'm going to try and make as many of these as possible, covering all sorts of different creative work, looking at studios, looking at different creative processes behind the scenes of movies and films, all kinds of interesting creative work to delve into. So stay tuned for that. I've got a lot of really cool videos planned for the future, but until then, thanks for watching.